In attempting the psychological presentation and a psychopathological explanation of the typical characteristics of a concentration camp inmate, I may give the impression that the human being is completely and unavoidably influenced by his surroundings. But what about human liberty? Is there no spiritual freedom in regard to behavior and reaction to any given surroundings? Is that theory true, which would have us believe that man is no more than a product of many conditional and environmental factors, be they of biological, psychological, or sociological nature? Is man but an accidental product of these? Most important, do the prisoner's reaction to the singular world of the concentration camp prove that man cannot escape the influences of his surroundings? Does man have a choice of action in the face of such circumstances? We can answer these questions from experience as well as on principle. The experience of camp life show that man does have a choice of action. There were enough examples, often of heroic nature, which proved that apathy could be overcome, irritability suppressed. Man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress. We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walk through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way, and there's always choices to make. Every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threaten to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity to become molded into the form of the typical inmate. This is an excerpt of one of the most powerful memoirs that I've read, and I keep rereading since 2017. It was published in 1946, over 70 years ago, printed in over 50 languages, and sold over 16 million copies, and still selling. This is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. And in this book, Viktor Frankl shares his experience suffering and surviving the concentration camp during the Holocaust. This book is split into two parts. The first part is the memoir. The second part is his clinical practice, or as it's known, logotherapy. And the logotherapy part is best summarized by a quote which Viktor Frankl mentions multiple times in the book. It is Nietzsche's quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra: "He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow." And so this quote is the epitome of what Viktor Frankl is trying to point out in the book. In the first part of the book, he's going through his own experience. When they get taken to the camp, he's given a number, which is 1119104. And from there, he spends most of his time digging, laying tracks for the railway line. At one point, he digs a tunnel. Everything is taken from the inmates when they arrive. So when they arrive at the camp, they're lined up and they're essentially split up into two different groups. One group goes to the left, one group goes to the right. When Viktor Frankl's in line, he gets pointed to one side of the group. He goes there. His friend gets split off and he goes to the other side. And then the other side gets marched off into a different part. So then he turns to an inmate who's been around for a while. And he asks the inmate, "When will I see my friend again?" The inmate looks at him and says, "You can see your friend right now." And he points to the smoke coming up from a chimney from a building. And Frankl doesn't at this point understand what's going on. But what's essentially happened is his friend has been gassed and has been burned. And that's just the start. Once these group that hasn't been killed, they are put in a room and told that they have 2 minutes to take everything off. And so the officer says, "I will give you 2 minutes and I shall time you by my watch. In these 2 minutes, you will get fully undressed and drop everything on the floor where you are standing. You will take nothing with you except your shoes, your belt or suspenders, and possibly a truss. I am starting to count now." And everybody rushes to take everything off. And then when they take everything off, they are then put into another room. Their whole body is shaved, everything. And he goes on to say, While we were waiting for the shower after being shaved, our nakedness was brought home to us. We really had nothing except our bare bodies, even minus hair. All we possessed, literally, was our naked existence. When you're reading this book, you have to pause because things that he describes are quite horrific at times. But Viktor Frankl comes out of this mentally in a much stronger place than he was when he went in. And he believes that part of that is because he had something to live for. His point is that man's search for meaning is the primary motivation of his life. And if he doesn't have that, then he will just give up at the slightest struggle. And in this situation, in one of the worst struggles. So he says, man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life and not a secondary rationalization of instinctual drive. This meaning is unique and specific in that it must be fulfilled by him alone, and only then does it achieve a significance which will satisfy his own will to meaning. You have to be the one that not only seeks meaning, but you have to be the one who manifests this. Nobody else can do it on your behalf, and nobody else can suffer on your behalf. And Viktor Frankl talks about this. He says, nobody can suffer on your behalf. You have to be the one that bears the suffering. And you have to make yourself worthy of the suffering. And we'll get to this point a bit later on. But in the beginning of the book, he's asked, hey, what do you think about this bestseller status of your book? And he says, I don't see it all in the bestseller status of my book so much an achievement and accomplishment on my part as an expression of the misery of our time. If hundreds of thousands of people reach out for a book whose very title promises to deal with the questions of a meaning to life, it must be a question that burns under their fingernails. And this hasn't changed since 1945. Right? We are still in this era, and we will continue to be so, because the more atomized that we've become living in urban cities, the more and more people are starting to find that they're living meaningless life, that the work that they do, they're just doing unfulfilling work, and people are seeking to do work that's fulfilling, one, but also they want to live a life that's meaningful. And it doesn't have to be a grand old life. It just has to be meaningful. The thing with Viktor Frankl's book is he wasn't planning on putting his name on this book, but the publisher convinced him to do so, so that people can know that the person who's writing about the experiences was somebody who experienced it. And so putting his name ultimately became very important. It allowed people to resonate with him, those who were in the camps, obviously, and those who've suffered in other areas of life. When suffering arises, you must embrace suffering and become worthy of the suffering that is before you. Because in so doing, your spirit is elevated, and that is how you forge meaning through the suffering. There's a quote by Seneca that came to my mind, and it's this: the bravest sight in the world is to see a great man struggling against adversity. For the Stoics, a truly great man was someone who overcame all the challenges that was put before him, and the challenges and the struggles were put before him by none other than the gods. Right? The gods were the one who put these suffering in the way to test the man. And so Hercules, for example, would not be Hercules if he hadn't overcome all the trials and all the things that he had to go through. Similarly, when you are suffering, you have to embrace the suffering. You cannot look to numb the suffering by mindlessly scrolling through Instagram, or avoiding the suffering by spending your time binge watching or spending your time drinking. You have to face and confront the reality. In so doing, you're on your journey to becoming a great man. Viktor Frankl says, fundamentally, therefore, any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him, mentally and spiritually. He may retain his human dignity even in a concentration camp. Dostoevsky once said, there is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings. These words frequently came to my mind after I became acquainted with those martyrs, whose behavior in camp, whose suffering and death bore witness to the fact that the last inner freedom cannot be lost. It can be said that they were worthy of their suffering. The way they bore their suffering was a genuine inner achievement. It is this spiritual freedom which cannot be taken away that makes life meaningful and purposeful. This in stark contrast to inmates who are freed at the end of the war, who takes their suffering as a badge to do whatever they want because they think, I've suffered and I've been deprived of all these pleasures and all these goods, so I can make other people suffer. And he tells a story of how one of his inmate friends, they're out in the field, after they're free, they're walking around. It's a farm. The people in the village nearby, they talk about, they're like, oh, I'm so sorry about what happened to you. We didn't know this was happening, etc., etc. So this inmate, he just decides to run through a field, like a farm field of crops, and he's just destroying the crop. And Frankl tells him to stop, and his friend says, no, I'm not going to stop because I've suffered, and what I'm doing is nothing compared to what I've gone through. And so the inner freedom that Frankl talks about is an inner freedom of virtue, because he truly believes that those who have suffered virtuously in not only embracing the suffering, but in taking upon themselves the responsibility to give peace and love to the other inmates, he finds that tremendously valuable, and he has a huge respect for them. In becoming worthy of your suffering, he tells a story of a rabbi who comes to him after the whole thing's done, a rabbi who has lost his wife and 6 of his kids. He's essentially filled with existential anxiety at this point. And here's Frankl. He had lost his first wife and their 6 children in the concentration camp of Auschwitz, where they were gassed. And now it turned out that his second wife was sterile. I observed that procreation is not the only means of life, for then life in itself would become meaningless, and something in which in itself is meaningless cannot be rendered meaningful, merely by its perpetuation. However, the rabbi evaluated his plight as an Orthodox Jew in terms of despair that there was no son of his own would ever say a Kaddish for him after his death. Side note here, Kaddish is the Jewish prayer for the dead, and I'm continuing. But I would not give up. I made a last attempt to help him by inquiring whether he did not hope to see his children again in heaven. However, my question was followed by an outburst of tears. And now the true reason for his despair came to the fore. He explained that his children, since they died as innocent martyrs, were thus found worthy of the highest place in heaven. But as for himself, he could not expect, as an old sinful man, to be assigned the same place. I did not give up, but retorted, is it not conceivable, Rabbi, that precisely this was the meaning of your surviving your children, that you may be purified through these years of suffering, so that finally you too, though not innocent like your children, may become worthy of joining them in heaven? Is it not written in the Psalms that God preserves all your tears? So perhaps none of your suffering were in vain. For the first time in many years, he found relief from his suffering through the new point of view which I was able to open up to him. When I read that story, it was a very powerful reminder, because when you've gone through any sort of suffering of a loss of those you love, there are times after where you cannot make sense of why it all happened. But being able to view the whole thing in a new perspective, to see it in the way of something like what Frankl did for the rabbi, where the suffering right now was so that he could become worthy of being in heaven, to be able to see his kids. That sort of slight change in perspective can make a huge difference, especially when you're going through a difficult time. He talks about how many of his patients, they lack the awareness of a meaning worth living for. They are haunted by the experiences of their inner emptiness, a void within themselves. They are caught in that situation which I've called the existential vacuum. The existential vacuum is a widespread phenomenon of the 20th century. No instinct tells him what he has to do. No tradition tells him what he ought to do. Sometimes he does not even know what he wishes to do. Instead, he either wishes to do what other people do, conformism, or he does what other people wish him to do, totalitarianism. And this is what I was getting at earlier when I said that we who live in urban places often suffer this existential vacuum that he talks about, because you are separated from tradition. You're separated from historically your village, because you're ripped out of your village and you're plugged into an urban place where everybody is a stranger, but there's tons of you. And so you could be walking downtown with tons of people, but you could feel the loneliest you've ever felt. One of the reasons for this is the inner emptiness, that many people go through, where they just don't know what they're doing. They're just going through the motion. Whereas you could be in a small village somewhere in India, somewhere in Central Africa with only a handful of people, and you could feel like the happiest and most embraced person in the world. And for Viktor Frankl, when he's in the concentration camp, one of the most important things to him is having a full inner life. An inner life to him is what happens in his mind, the story that he tells himself. As the inner life of the prisoner tends to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before. Under their influence, he sometimes even forgot his own frightful circumstances. Frankl often envisioned a future with all the emotion, with all the sense, with all the smell of him talking about his experience to other people in a lecture room. He talks about how he's standing in this lecture hall and there are people dressed listening to him talk about his experience in the concentration camp. And that allowed him to see his experience as something that he's already overcome. That was a big thing for somebody who only has one pair of shirt, one shoe. Essentially, it looks like a skeleton because they're not fed enough. They're only fed one piece of bread a day. And if you're good and they reward you, you'll get a cigarette. But you don't smoke your cigarette either, because the only people who smoked cigarettes were people who had given up on life. So having an inner life was very, very important. And it was very early on when he gets to the concentration camp that he realizes this, because he says, we were surprised, inmates were surprised at what they could endure, because there were nights, sleepless nights, that day after day, the guards would just wake them up to go work in the freezing weather. They slept on a 6.5 and 8 feet bed made of boards, and 9 men slept on it sharing 2 blankets. There was no heater, no fireplace, nothing. And there was 9 men. They all slept using 2 blankets. And men who were light sleepers found themselves that they could sleep through anything, Talked about how even though they never brushed their teeth, their gums were healthier than ever before. Even though they didn't get enough sleep, they were somehow able to work to very physical labor, manual labor. Frankl would often also take bus rides in his mind. He would go to the bus stop, get on the bus. He would imagine all of these things, all that sensation of opening the door, stepping up, seeing people. And for him, this was an escape. The only way that Viktor Frankl could explain how prisoners who normally, if you're just looking at them, you'd think would not survive this whole experience, survived, who were physically not as strong as other people, was that it was their mental life. It was that they had this spiritual life, this inner freedom that he talks about. And it was that allowed them to overcome whatever that they were experiencing in front of them. But this doesn't mean, just because the inner life was full, didn't mean that the reality was any better. And he talks about how oftentimes there were, people sleeping. You could tell that they were having nightmares, right? Because they were flailing around and sometimes screaming. But the other inmates would not wake them up. And the reason they wouldn't is because, Viktor Frankl says, I shall never forget how I was aroused one night by the groans of a fellow prisoner who threw himself about in his sleep, obviously having a horrible nightmare. Since I had always been especially sorry for people who suffer from fearful dreams or delirium, I wanted to wake the poor man. Suddenly, I drew back the hand which was ready to shake him, frightened at the thing I was about to do. At that moment, I became intensely conscious of the fact that no dream, no matter how horrible, could be as bad as the reality of the camp which surrounded us, and to which I was about to recall him. Right, so the experience still, as terrible as it is, Frankl continues to espouse that it is your mind and it is your ability to overcome, your mind's ability to overcome the present circumstances which will determine your future state. So he says there are 3 ways to find meaning. 1 is by creating a work or doing a deed. 2, by experiencing something or encountering someone. 3, by the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. The second is by experiencing beauty, goodness, and truth, and nature and culture. The first, essentially, is by doing works of craftsmanship, doing research, whatever it is. And third, that we've talked about now, is confronting the unavoidable suffering in front of you. And he says, a man's concern, even his despair over the worthwhileness of life, is an existential distress, but by no means a mental disease. But prisoners who had given up on this had given up on living, what would happen is that they would smoke their own cigarettes. So cigarettes were a store of value in the camps. Rewarded cigarettes for doing extremely difficult work, then they would give you cigarettes. But oftentimes, the actual smoking of cigarettes was only reserved for the capos, and these capos were old inmates who became guards. And oftentimes, these capos would treat other inmates very, very poorly, and worse than the guards would treat them. So he says, the privilege of actually smoking cigarettes was reserved for the capo who had his assured quota of weekly coupons, or possibly for a prisoner who worked as a foreman in a warehouse or workshop and received a few cigarettes in exchange for doing dangerous work. The only exception to this were those who had lost the will to live and wanted to enjoy their last day. Thus, when we saw a comrade smoking his own cigarettes, we knew he had given up faith in his strength to carry on, and once lost the will to live seldom returned. A man who could not see the end of his provisional existence was not able to aim at an ultimate goal in life. He ceased living for the future, in contrast to a man in normal life. Therefore, the whole structure of his inner life changed. Signs of decay set in which we know from other areas of life. And so he tells a story of a senior block warden who has a dream, right? And in this dream, the senior block warden is talking to an angel. And the angel says, ask me any question. So the block warden, whose name is F asks the angel, the voice, when will we be rescued from this place? And this is in February 1945. Right? So the voice tells F, March 30th. So F tells Viktor Frankl that they're going to be rescued March 30th. This guy is in full anticipation and hope and full of strength. But as the day progresses and March 30th draws closer and closer and closer, and there is no sign of the war ending, it actually seems like it's getting worse, F's strength begins to fade. Then on March 29th, he has a high fever, and then on March 30th, he becomes delirious and loses consciousness. On March 31st, the senior block warden, who believed with his being that on March 30th they were going to be saved, on March 31st, he was dead. And so Frankl says, his faith in the future and will to live had become paralyzed. His body fell victim to illness, and thus the voice of his dream was right after all. But up until that time had come, F was very strong and full of hope. And so Frankl puts this and contrasts this to himself and to other of his inmates, specifically to two potential suicides that were prevented. And so he talks about how two people were on the verge of suicide, and lots of people committed suicide in the camps by hanging themselves. And there was a rule in the camp that you were not allowed to cut loose the news of somebody hanging. And so even if you saw your friend hanging, you did not intervene. So there were two men who wanted to commit suicide. And after Frankl talks to them, both of them changed their mind. And the reason they changed their mind is precisely that they had a will to meaning. They had a reason to live. And for one of the men, it was his child waiting for him after this whole thing ends. And it is the hope and the anticipation of this that helps him to overcome the suffering that's before him. And the other was a scientist. And the scientist believed that he still had discoveries to make, papers to write. And so it was this hope for the future that helped him to not commit suicide and to keep on living, and gave him a reason to live. These tasks, and therefore the meaning of life, differ from man to man, from moment to moment. Thus, it is impossible to define the meaning of life in a general way. Questions about the meaning of life can never be answered by sweeping statements like, life does not mean something vague, but something very real and concrete. Just as life's tasks are also very real and concrete. They form man's destiny, which is different and unique for each individual. No man, no destiny can be compared with any other man or any other destiny. No situation repeats itself, and each situation calls for a different response. Sometimes, the situation in which man finds himself may require him to shape his own fate by action. If there is meaning in life at all, then there must be meaning in suffering. Suffering in an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. Then he goes on to say, naturally, only a few people were capable of reaching great spiritual heights, but a few were given the chance to attain human greatness, even though their apparent worldly failure and death, an accomplishment which in ordinary circumstances they would have never achieved. In accepting this challenge to suffer bravely, life has a meaning to the last moment, and it retains this meaning literally to the end. In other words, life's meaning is an unconditional one, for it even includes the potential meaning of unavoidable suffering. And that's like when a man finds that it is his destiny to suffer, he will have to accept his suffering as his task, his single and unique task. He will have to acknowledge the fact that even in suffering, he is unique and alone in the universe. No one can relieve him of his suffering or suffer in his place. His unique opportunities lie in the way in which he bears his burden. This whole thing is this idea that you must carry your cross, that you must be the bearer of your own suffering. Nobody can suffer on your behalf. Nobody will come and save you from your suffering. You must be the one who takes it upon yourself to overcome it. And it is only through that, when you accept that suffering and go through it virtuously and in a brave manner, that's when you find the meaning. So when we return to this camp, Frankl says, any attempt to restore a man's inner strength in the camp had first to succeed in showing him some future goal. Nietzsche's word, he who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow, could be the guiding motto. There is nothing in this world, I venture to say, that would so effectively help one survive even in the worst condition as the knowledge that there is meaning in one's life. And then he goes on to quote again Nietzsche. He says, there is much wisdom in the words of Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. This quote by Nietzsche is a summary of the whole thing. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. He quotes that as well. For Frankl, men cannot live in comfort, in abundance of comfort, because in so doing he loses his will to live, because his will to meaning is completely destroyed by the comfort. So he says, what man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. So you must put before yourself a task that makes you strive and makes you struggle daily, and struggle in not a sadistic manner, but in a way in which your whole being is absorbed and called to the task at hand. So anybody who does any form of martial art knows that the reason martial art historically has been part of cultivating one's virtue is because it requires the whole body, the whole being. Right? You cannot be sparring and turn your mind off and focus on something else, because if that happens, then you're going to get beat up. And so it requires the whole body to be present. And there's a constant flow of learning that happens with each practice. You continue to get better and better and better, and it requires both your mind and your body. And this is similar to craftsmen. The craft that they do, whether they're a carpenter, whether they're a blacksmith, it requires the presence of their whole being. Especially craftsmen where you can see that they've spent a whole lifetime learning and continue to become great at the craft that they do. And this is why even to date, Japanese craftsmen are seen as some of the greatest, because they will dedicate their whole life perfecting it. They will dedicate every single waking hour to becoming 1% better. And when you're engaged in such a task, the struggle that you face becomes absorbed into the task that you're doing. So then the obstacle becomes the path. And this should be hopeful for you, because if you're listening to this, it means that you still have the ability to pursue what you are passionate about, what you can give 100% of your energy towards. And here Frankl says, live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you're about to act now. A quote that eerily reminds you of a Confucius one, where he says, a man has two lives, the second begins when he realizes he only has one. The challenge here is for you to live courageously, because you are now confronted with your finiteness and the finality of this life. You've already died knowing that you're going to die. Most people don't even realize that they're going to die. They live as if they're never going to die. And then when they're on their deathbed, they realize, I wish I had done X instead of this. So none of us are in the situation that Frankl is in. And so we have every opportunity and we have the freedom to pursue the things that you love and to perfect the craft that you want to perfect. And there is no reason for many of us to be in this existential crisis, right? The rates of suicide are quite high and they continue to rise. And there's no one solution for any of this, but that the will to meaning is very, very important in one's life. The will to meaning is what, as Frankl says, a man who becomes conscious of his responsibility he bears towards another human being who affectionately waits for him, or to an unfinished work, will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why for his existence and will be able to bear almost any how. And the unfinished work is the craft. The unfinished work is cultivating the virtue. The unfinished work is becoming a better human, becoming antifragile, living with your conviction. It's vitally important to stand firm in your belief with your conviction and to not become prey to the crowd, to be willing to stand firm in what you believe in, to not be pressured into changing your mind, into doing something that somebody wants you to do. And it all starts with yourself. You have to find your will to meaning, and that is done through embracing the obstacles in the way, in embracing the idea that there is something about this life that you're living that is not just a random coincidence. Because if you live as if this whole thing is a random coincidence of luck, of pure chance, then your life is no different than had you not lived. A man who lets himself decline because he could not see any future goal found himself occupied with retrospective thoughts. So these are people who have their minds preoccupied with what has happened in the past because it's fate. But as Frankl says, you can shape your fate by your action, and the action must be taken. I want to touch on an important aspect of the book, which is the power of love. And Frankl says love is one of the greatest will to meaning. When he realizes the power of love, for a long time it was just a concept to him. But when he finally realizes, it changes his world. So he says, a thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is, set into songs by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret the human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love, and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved, in a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his suffering in the right way, an honorable way. In such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words, "The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of the infinite." And he mentions this when he's dreaming and thinking about his wife. Right? He doesn't know at this point that his wife has died, but it is the thought of his wife and the hope that his wife is doing better and is not in such a situation as his that gives him the strength. But it's beyond that, because during his time in the concentration camp, he gets to a point where he begins to have conversations with his wife, and his visualization becomes so strong that he can feel her beside him. And there are things that happen as he's conversing with his wife that, makes it feel like she's actually there. And obviously he finds out later that his wife has died. So this is him talking to his wife, feeling her presence. Another time we were at work in a trench. The dawn was gray around us. Gray was the sky above us, gray the snow in the pale light of dawn, gray the rags in which my fellow prisoners were clad, and gray their faces. I was again conversing silently with my wife, or perhaps I was struggling to find the reason for my suffering, my slow dying. In a last violent protest against the hopelessness of imminent death, I sensed my spirit piercing through the enveloping gloom. I felt it transcend that hopelessness, meaningless world. And from somewhere I heard a victorious yes in answer to my question of the existence of an ultimate purpose. At that moment, a light was lit in a distant farmhouse, which stood on the horizon as if painted there in the midst of the miserable gray of a dawning morning in Bavaria. Et lux in tenebris lucet, which is a translation of the light shineth in the darkness. For hours I stood hacking at the icy ground. The guard passed by insulting me, and once I communed with my beloved. More and more I felt that she was present and that she was with me. I had the feeling that I was able to touch her, able to stretch out my hand and grasp hers. The feeling was very strong. She was there. Then, at that very moment, a bird flew down silently and perched just in. As Frankl says, I didn't know if she were alive. I only knew one thing, which I have learned well by now. Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in the spiritual being, his inner self, whether or not she is actually present, whether or not she is still alive at all, ceases somehow to be of importance. The last part I want to go over about love with Frankl here is, when near the end, when he thinks he's going to essentially get gassed because he gets put on a truck to go to rest camps, and rest camps are places where basically people die or people get gassed, and he has the opportunity to not go, but he says, you know what, I'm going to go. I'm not going to try to escape. So when he's put on the truck, he tells his friend who's remaining behind in this camp, he says, listen, Otto, if I don't get back home to my wife, and if you should see her again, tell her that I talked of her daily, hourly. You remember? Secondly, I have loved her more than anyone. Thirdly, the short time I have been married to her outweighs everything, even all we have gone through. This quote obviously makes me tear up because here is a man who doesn't know whether his wife is alive. And the thought of losing your soulmate is something that I have wrestled with over the past few years. And it's a very difficult and emotional journey just to overcome that. Confronting your own death sometimes is easier than confronting the possible death of your loved one, because you are the one who's going to remain behind, right? It's just like the rabbi. And so it is important to make sure that in facing your own mortality, that you, in the process, also face the possible situation that you could lose your loved one as well. And there is, on the other side of it, you come out much stronger, but as you're wrestling through it, it's very difficult. You can tell how much he loved his wife and how much she meant to him during all the suffering. And it was his love for his wife, above all things, that allowed him to endure the harsh reality of the concentration camps. And it also made him a better person, also made him not fall to his lowest base desires, as some other people did when they were rescued. And he says, a man's character became involved to the point that he was caught in a mental turmoil which threatened all the values he held and threw them in doubt, under the influence of a world which no longer recognized the value of human life and human dignity, which had robbed man of his will and made him an object to be exterminated. The important thing that we can learn from this is being able to suffer bravely, honorably, and to have a very strong inner life and have the spiritual freedom that he talks about, where you can transcend your current environment, your current situation. And you can do this through the love that you have, but also have the will to meaning of having something greater than yourself that gives you reason to persist through the suffering, and to make sure that you do not and get dragged down to the mud of your base desires when you are going through the difficult situations, as some people did after they were rescued. So he says, a human being is not one thing among others. Things determine each other, but man is ultimately self-determining. What he becomes within the limits of endowment and environment, he is made out of himself. In the concentration camps, for example, in this living laboratory and on this testing ground, we watched and witnessed some of our comrades behave like swine, while others behave like saints. Man has both potentialities within himself. Which one is actualized depends on the decisions, but not on conditions. I highly recommend buying and reading Man's Search for Meaning. It is a testament to the indomitable human spirit and what you and anybody who's going through a difficult time, who might be suffering, that you can endure it, that you can overcome it. We suffer more in our imagination than in reality. And Frankl here proved that point over and over and over again. And the last thing I want to end with was something that I had missed the first few times that I read it. And it was the importance of solitude. Solitude here, it's interesting because in the concentration camp, you have to be careful that you're not spending too much time alone, because then if you're spending too much time alone, the guards would get suspicious, or they might think that you're weak and you can't do work, or you're avoiding work, so then they'll transport you to these rest camps. Rest camps are where oftentimes you get gassed. But even though this was the case, even though solitude was dangerous, prisoners all sought after solitude. Oftentimes it wasn't a ton of time, but it would be a few minutes here, a few minutes there. And it was important for them to find this because it was there that they would be able to create this reality in their mind where they can visualize, the future, visualize seeing their kids, visualize providing, giving a lecture or doing research or replaying music in their head, right? And for Frankl, he found solitude behind a tent on top of a shaft that led down to a water pipe. And he would squat there beside these corpses. And in those few minutes that he had, he would let his mind wander. I just sat there and looked out at the green flowering slopes and the distant blue hills on the Bavarian landscape. I dreamed longingly and thoughts wandered. This to me is a reminder that in our lives, we need to find solitude in this noisy, busy world that we live in, where everything is seeking after our attention. You have to cultivate silence in your life. You have to find ways to cultivate this, whether that's waking up early in the morning when nobody else is awake in the family to spend time on your own, or whether that's late at night, whatever your schedule looks like, it is important to do this. And something that I recently started doing was giving myself a few days of solitude, where I would just spend those few days reading, reflecting, meditating, praying. And what I've found is in so doing, my spirit is rejuvenated. I feel different. I feel energized. And this is something I think you should implement and find ways to do this. Oftentimes, people look forward to vacations, right? Oh, my vacation's coming up in X amount of days. We have Christmas time coming up. And lots of people will say, oh, during Christmas, that's when I'm going to do my solitude, my reflection. But it hardly ever happens, because when you're on vacation, your mind tends to turn off. And so then it becomes quite difficult to re-enter a state in which you have to be intentional about finding rest. Rest related to solitude is something that has to be cultivated. Most people think that resting is just sitting there, binge watching Netflix. That's not rest, right? Solitude is something more similar to what Viktor Frankl does in Man's Search for Meaning, where he's able to meditate and envision a different world in which he wants to exist within. And in so doing, your mind, your body is able to live in that future moment for a minute, 2 minutes, an hour, and then transport yourself back into the here and now to bring forth that reality through your actions in the present.